Well, hello, and thank you again for joining the Purchasing Made Personal podcast. I'm your host, Michael Tucker, and we've got a fun one today. Today with us, we have Sarah Reynolds, who is our counsel at TIPS. So, Sarah, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me today. Yes, I'm Sarah Reynolds. I am outside counsel for TIPS Purchasing Cooperative, and my practice on public procurement.
I always brag about you, just to be honest. By far, in my opinion, pretty biased, but honestly, procurement lawyers are far and few in between,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially when you focus on them. And what you've done, and if we can talk about history, we can talk about what we're doing now, wherever this goes, but what you've become since meeting you even
Uh-huh.
is one of the foremost procurement lawyers in, I would say, in the nation. So
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. Yes, it is a unique area of the law. Not a lot of attorneys in it, and I do represent public entities generally in the state of Texas. But certainly, my practice has been very focused on public procurement, and I sort of grew up in the legal practice through tips and with tips, which has
yeah.
given me a really broad understanding of procurement law in my home state, but also throughout the nation. So I appreciate you saying that.
Well, it comes up often, and I'm not the only one who says it. So we'll just go with that for there for now. But so, okay, as a cooperative is concerned, we're going out to RFPs, we're completing a bid process. It's similar, but not the same as an agency doing their own bid.
Uh-huh.
So, just to set a baseline here, where do attorneys, lawyers come in to help a cooperative, and maybe talk about a little more about what you're doing at the cooperative level, what your role is specifically on the RFPs, the evaluation, whatever. I'll kind of let you take the field on that, on wherever you might want to go with it.
Yeah. So, specifically in my representation of tips as a purchasing cooperative, the focus is assisting with the procurement process and making it as broadly compliant as possible. So,
Mm,
when you're dealing with a purchasing cooperative that operates on a national scale like TIPS does, it has members throughout the nation. They are different entity types, they're in different states, they have different local policies. And so we do need to follow specific state and federal law for TIPS purposes as a public entity itself. But we
mhm.
also want to include as many state and federal certifications and public entity protections to cover as many laws and policies throughout the nation as possible. And so, my focus when drafting the solicitation documents like RFPs and requests for competitive sealed proposals is to cover as much legal ground as possible. So, if you read through one of TIP's contracts, one of their bid documents, if you're looking for a state or federal required certification, you will typically find it. It's to be as compliant and broad as possible, making sure TIPS is compliant with its own laws, but covering as many public entity laws as possible throughout the nation.
Right. And this is something that I deal with as a program manager all the time. Literally, before we got on and recorded, I got a call from Oklahoma asking, hey, where can we see where our choice of law and venue is? Or there's all kinds of things that are happening that are needs, definite needs of public agencies. But when you look at it, the average run of all of our due diligence is about 200 pages long. When you consider, I mean, I'm not exaggerating, because
No,
we
yeah.
got our original RFP, we've got their response, scans of our advertisements, and it's like you said, it's all an effort to meet the needs of as many public agencies as possible. And our world is a little different because cooperatives are going out for proposals for future work. So that's
Yes.
a whole nother thing that we kind of have to plan for. And I'd say we'd gotten pretty good at it.
Yeah.
But how does that come into effect when, obviously, like, we're not going out to bid for a playground today, right?
Mhm.
But we're assessing. How does that come into effect on awarding vendors?
Mhm.
And maybe talk a little bit about the evaluation of what are the differences of evaluating an actual project versus a cooperative contract?
Yeah, so you stated it correctly. We are preparing a solicitation, not for a specific project or a specific commodity or service, but for a category of goods and services. And
Yeah.
it's an indefinite quantity over a specified period of time. This contract type, this cooperative procurement method, was really developed. By the US government, the federal government, especially with military and government federal agency procurements. And so
Okay.
the idea is that we are creating a government contract that covers a specified category. It may be broad, it may be something like technology solutions, products and services. And we are including all the compliance, the certifications, we're specifying the scope, but of course, a member in 2 weeks might be purchasing iPads off that contract, and in 3 years, an entirely different public entity in a different state might be purchasing millions of dollars in technology upgrades or technology services and assistance. So it is a unique structure. When I'm helping a public entity do their own bid, we're very careful. We need this many items.
Mhm.
A line item, a bid typically with very specific specifications. Here, we are trying to cover as much ground as possible in that category while establishing firm legal requirements and establishing firm discounts and pricing that must be honored through
Mhm.
the duration of the contract. So it is different, but it's not unique in the sense that it has been done by government agencies for many decades. It is
Right.
established procurement method, but it is different. You aren't going to, if you're a school buying a playground, find the specifications for your playground. But what you will find is the contractual pricing, the discounts that are required to be granted because of that bidding process, and the legal certifications that you would want to see in a solicitation of this type.
Right. Wow, that was very cumbersome. I love it. So we taking a step back for anyone that may not know, we mentioned this, I think I said it, we said it. This is our world, right, Sarah? But when we say or when people hear competitively solicited contract, okay, that jargon can have different meanings across the country. I know that just from experience. But from your perspective, from the attorney's office, so to speak, what does actually that mean in definition that can then be applied to public procurement?
Yeah. So the way it typically works is you follow your state's procurement laws as a public
Mhm.
entity. So if any of your public entity members listening, then once you hit a certain threshold according to your laws and your policies, then typically a certain dollar amount or a certain contract type, you have to perform a legally specified procurement process. And so, as I represent TIPS, which is a public entity of the state of Texas, I turn to the legal procurement methods available to that public entity. And it might say it varies by state, but it may say you've got to leave the solicitation open for at least 30 days. You have to include the specifications. You must accept sealed bids. It varies, by state, it varies by entity, but when attorneys or people say competitive bidding process, we're talking about the legal requirements for a specific public entity that they must follow when using public funds to buy something. And every state has their variation, but generally, if you hear bidding process, competitive bidding process, it means that public entity turned to the laws of its state and any federal laws and followed the prescribed process uh,
Right.
to be able to expend those public funds on goods or services. Unlike us, if we want something as private citizens, we can go buy
Right.
it from the store, but public entities under federal and state law cannot expend public funds freely. They have
Right.
to show that they've compared pricing or vendors, and the specificity, the laws that apply depend very much on the circumstances, but there must be some level of legal competitive procurement that takes place before they use those public funds.
Right. And as I'm going around training vendors in my role on how to utilize a tips contract, but really it has to become more of a high level of this is how you service public agencies before they can even use a tips contract, right?
Yes.
I've coined the phrase of we've got to justify the public's dollar, right?
Yeah.
We've got to, they have to appear through different things, not only in the procurement process, but then have to appear before the school board or might have to appear before the state on the municipalities or something like that, right? They're doing everything that they need to. Tips is 200 pages of due diligence or an agency's own bid, right? To justify the public's dollar that was spent. And it's not just preferred or best practice, it's a legal requirement, right? So,
Yeah.
on that part, unless you had something more to add to that, what does a cooperative have to do to make sure that it's we hate this word, but because, compliance is in the eye of the beholder and the state.
Yep.
And like you said before, we're based in Texas. Does it line up with the state of Utah? Yes, there might be more steps to take, but there's ways that we can work with this, right? So,
Yeah.
what does a cooperative have to do to best position itself to be able to service public agencies across the country?
Yeah, so like you said, compliance is in the eye of the beholder, but also
Mhm.
compliance is in the statute that applies to you. It's in the
Right.
eye of the auditor that might take a
Yep.
look at your public purchase. It's in the eye of the public that might take a look at this purchase. Public entities
Yeah.
are subject to public scrutiny, questioning, their own
Yes.
boards, their auditors. So the role of the cooperative is, as I discussed earlier, covering and providing as many public entity protections as possible in its solicitation or bid, to use a general term, and in
Mhm.
its contract with the awarded vendors. So when these vendors propose, they're required to fill out all these certifications and agree to all these government entity protections. And so the role of the cooperative is to include as many protections as possible to ensure the broadest public entity compliance possible. But
Okay.
and the other role of the cooperative, in my opinion, is to encourage the vendors and the public entity members to ensure that beyond that broad compliance, their direct purchase agreement contains any other local requirements, wage rate requirements, anything additional or more specific, really, than what any cooperative can provide. So cooperatives cover as much of this as possible, but you, public entity or vendors, if you're listening, that are
Mhm.
working with these public entities, the next step and the role of the cooperative is encouraging you both to add any other specific protections, enter specific agreements, in addition to and supplementing the terms and conditions of the cooperative or TIPS solicitation and vendor agreement.
Right, and obviously, we already mentioned this is not only in the best interest of, the public agencies, but it's required, but it is in their best interest. That's why these, policies are in place. That's why that there is so much documentation, but and again, even to the vendor who might be listening to this, it's in your best interest. Because the best thing that you can do to serve public agencies is understand what they have to do to serve the public, right?
Yeah.
And so when you become a vendor, and it is a skill, it's a skill that vendors need to develop. on how to understand the inner workings of public procurement, right?
Right.
And just like you, Sarah, where you kind of have specialized in this in procurement law, um, vendors who service the public agencies do need to specialize in that. Now, are we here to help them? Absolutely. That's what program managers at TIPS are generally doing day in and day out. And then the best part is once you establish the pattern, once you have that steep learning curve, it's smooth sailing there and out because you kind of know what's going to happen before it happens. And then you become a better resource for public agencies. Again, this is kind of for the vendors there. But so all this documentation for maybe a new procurement officer or, like I said, a vendor who's trying to understand how to better serve, what does all this documentation take place? What does it do? And what is the purpose?
Mhm.
What's why does all of this documentation matter? We mentioned that we're trying to meet as many statutes as possible,
Yeah.
but I guess the question next is why? You know?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. So yes, we've established why because it's required by law. We must.
Yeah.
But second to that, you said it also is in their best interest, the public entities, the public expenditures best interest. And I'd agree
Mhm.
with that too. I think it can be really cumbersome and difficult for these public and administratively burdensome for these public entities.
Sure.
So you have people who are educators or city managers, and they have their daily operations that they are
Mm.
managing. And they have their career, their path that has nothing to do with public procurement. And then in addition to that,
Yes.
they're now subject to um, state laws and federal laws, and they're just trying to buy something and they're not trying to do anything wrong. And they're
Yeah.
um, fearful that they're going to accidentally violate the law. And so um, it is admittedly, as a lawyer for public entities, very burdensome for public entities. But I do have to say, in my experience in public procurement, it does foster transparency. It does
Mhm.
often result
Absolutely.
in the most cost effective solutions and in the most reputable vendors being awarded. And so I do think the rationale behind this administratively burdensome process is is resulting in better prices and better vendors. And I do think that the cooperative purchasing solution is so ideal when it's accessible to public entities because now you can reduce that administrative burden. You no longer have to spend 2 months developing a bid, posting it, advertising it, waiting. You don't have to do that administratively burdensome process, which does cost the public entity time and money. When it's allowed by your laws and policies, public entity, you can still select your vendor who has gone through a public competitive process. So the cooperative process allows you to eliminate that administrative burden while still getting the competitive pricing and the reputable vendors that pass this process and agree to all these government protections. So I do think it is mandated by law, but I think it's also in the best interest of everyone involved to get those public funds to the best vendor for the job. But also, you mentioned, Michael, it's in the best interest of the vendor too. And so,
Mhm.
what does all this documentation mean? It means that you, vendor, your contract or your sale cannot be publicly invalidated. It can't be
Right.
voided for failure to be properly procured. It means you won't be in the public eye or in the newspaper for an invalid government purchase. So um, I do agree with you. I think to the extent our vendors that are listening can really grasp what the public entities are required to do, at least generally, how that is administratively burdened, how the cooperative solution helps both the compliance side and the efficiency side, and why all of this is beneficial to them is it keeps their sale to that government entity legal, reputable, and established. So it really
Yep.
is good for everyone. And I do recognize I can go on for on public procurement. I'm sorry, Michael, but I do
I
recognize
want it to come. Let's keep going.
I do recognize the vendor's frustration sometimes. They're like, "We want to sell this to this public entity. They want to
Hmm.
buy it. Make this happen." And where the public entity has some legal concerns or questions, I always encourage the vendor to be thoughtful and not pushy because where it's protecting the public entity, it's protecting you and your sale, your reputation, and the public funds that you're gonna be receiving. It's good for everyone involved.
Absolutely. I'm thinking of a time, it was this past summer actually, in New Mexico, where a lighting vendor had done a multi-million dollar lighting exchange in one of our schools, right? And sure enough, knock knock, here comes the auditor after the fact, right? And everyone's always hating on auditors. Well, no, they're part of the process, and our job is to follow the law, and their job is to make sure we did, right?
Mhm.
It's quid pro quo, right? But it speaks so highly to what we've done, and through your guidance, Sarah, for most of it, is that that auditor walked in. They called me. I remember it distinctly because it was 7:30 in the morning. Yeah, school's up and going.
Yeah.
They called me and said, "Hey, remember that lighting project that went through?" "Yeah." "Well, the auditor's here. They're on speaker with you." "Oh, great. I look forward to
Good.
these
Yeah.
because, I look forward to it." I said, "Okay, did you get that due diligence? Did you download it? Did you need another copy?" Right? "Oh, go get that. Here's our RFP. Here's the ad." And so here we are, essentially digitally, of course, but handing over 200 pages of justification and the pricing verification that we did at the time of purchase and all this stuff. And by 9 o'clock, that auditor had left the building,
Yeah.
which is what the public agency wanted, right? Again, no shame to auditors, but the
Yeah.
less they're there, the better we did. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's why it's in your best interest. Because
Yeah.
then, if you've ever been involved in an audit, you know, the public agency gets dragged through the mud. That vendor inherently could get dragged through the mud. And
Mhm.
no one wants that, right? Our job
No.
is to meet the auditing and legal requirements ahead of time so that that type of situation goes well, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The one
So,
step we can't stop or we can't cover for the parties, the vendor and the member, is that members look at their policy, their law, and
mhm,
confirmation that cooperative purchasing is appropriate for this purchase. That's
right.
something that must be done by that public entity member. But when they confirm, they look at their state law, they look at their policies. Yes, we can make a cooperative purchase in this circumstance. Once that is done, then they can turn to us to those
Mhm.
pages of compliance, those the documentation that establishes what rules were followed, what processes were followed, and that is such a great story. That is what we wanna hear every time
Yes.
from TIPS members, is that they confirmed that a cooperative purchase was appropriate. They did that one step, they proceeded with the purchase, and then whether it's public scrutiny, audit, um, vendor challenge from other vendors who weren't
Oh, yeah.
selected, we expect and hope that they'll be fully supported by that, extensive due diligence.
Absolutely. So, with that, and we've talked about all this due diligence that we've established, one of the biggest portions, at least in the central US that I'm covering, that's always asked for review is the scoring evaluation criteria,
Mhm.
right? So what are some of those what are some of those things that increase the integrity, I guess, of our tips contracts? If you could talk more a little behind the scenes. I know that that's primarily what you're doing just personally, right?
Yes.
But can we talk to that a little bit?
Yeah. So, what we're doing is we always establish the scoring criteria in the RFP. So, it may be behind the scenes, but it's also just public information. So,
Right.
anytime you're considering a tips vendor or vendor you want to see how you were selected, you turn to the bid or the RFP that you responded to in which the vendor was awarded under, and it will have that established criteria listed.
Mhm.
And when we close bids, we accept sealed bids always. And when we unseal those, what we're looking for is, did they meet that published criteria? And under the criteria, it will tell you in the bid what requirements, what documentation we are or can look at to
Hmm.
establish points. And so every vendor that's submitting is required to answer those. There's over 100 certifications they have to respond to. They must sign the vendor agreement with TIPS, which includes other government protections. And then in that submission, we're often looking at references. We're looking at supplemental documentation like qualifications and brochures and information about the specific goods and services offered. We're looking at discounted pricing. Every vendor is asked to propose a general discount and line item discounts to ensure that TIPS members and public entities are getting discounted pricing when possible. And we're also looking at the qualifications submitted. So every vendor that submits must perform certain tasks, agree to certain certifications, agree to the vendor agreement. So you're getting a lot of compliance, like we've discussed at length at this point. But you're also ideally getting best pricing, discounted pricing, um, verified references for construction, which follows a slightly different method. You're also looking at bonding capacity. So you're looking at financial stability through that bonding capacity representation. So it's not an easy feat. It's quite a bit of administrative work to submit even one bid to TIPS, and then every bit of that documentation is reviewed, questioned, assigned points, and there's fortunately for the public entities, unfortunately for the vendor, many ways to disqualify yourself if you don't
Hmm.
read and pay attention and meet the necessary qualifications. So that's a little insight into the background, and it does vary by bid type. But
Oh, of
anyone who's
course.
interested, you can look at the specific RFP, see the scoring criteria, the evaluation score sheets are always available upon request, so you can see how vendors are evaluated. It's a very transparent process.
But it has to be because everything we
Yeah,
do as a public agency is public information anyway. But so
sure.
on that note, switching gears and kind of laying the rest of this foundation is TIPS is a public agency of Texas. So then another way to phrase that for to establish our bid is we have a lead agency, right? So
Mhm.
what role does the lead agency do? What is that, and what structure does it play into a cooperative like TIPS?
Yeah, so it is the legal foundation for everything that we do. Cooperative purchasing is defined under federal law. It's defined under state law differently in each state, but essentially the crux of cooperative purchasing or cooperative interlocal cooperation, however it's defined in your jurisdiction, is public entities working together and providing goods or services to each other, working cooperatively
Mhm.
to harness buying power, or if one entity has access to something that another doesn't. So the sole purpose, the only thing that allows cooperative interaction is the interaction between government entities. So when you go and read the laws of our state or any state, it typically says the authorizing law that allows this says, we allow you, government entity, to work with other government entities in this way to provide purchasing services to each other or rely on each other to cooperatively procure things. And so TIPS is a public entity of the state of Texas. And the law in the state of Texas is that public entities in Texas can work with each other this way or with the entities of other states in this way. That's what allows TIPS, a public entity of the state of Texas, with its lead agency being a public entity here, It allows them to work with public entities and provide these services cooperatively to public entities here and throughout the nation. So, without a lead agency or without being a government entity, if a cooperative is just a private entity, it no longer falls under that authorizing law. No longer is it two public entities working together
Mhm.
cooperatively. Um, it would no longer be subject to these laws, which allow this structure throughout the nation.
Right. And that's something that gets tied up a lot right now for us is the feedback I hear when an attorney calls me, and I don't want them calling me, I want them calling you, Sarah, but they
Yeah.
call me. And they
Yeah.
say, "Hey, you guys are based in Texas. We don't want all of our disputes to be fileable in Texas, right?" I'm
Yeah.
like, "Well, that's easy. We've got a choice of law and venue that's tied to every single public agency membership where they have the option to put in their county and state, right?"
Mhm.
But so on that note, what are some other hiccups or things that people often trip over that you're seeing in your experience of what agencies might be bringing to you?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I'll say most of the time, the hiccups that are coming to me are misconceptions about cooperative purchasing or tips,
Hmm.
like you just described. So I'll often have lawyers who represent vendors or public entities in other states call or email me and say, "We can't use you. We can't litigate, have venue or choice of law in
Right.
Texas." Well, that's a misconception. What our contracts state is that you will use the choice of law and venue of the public entity, or
Mhm.
you and the vendor can agree to your own choice of law and venue, is essentially what it says. So I think most often what comes to me is really, how does this work? Even from lawyers, and even from procurement lawyers, how does this work? So just a general explanation. um, and then the most common questions are, uh, "We can't follow the laws of the state of Texas. How do we do this?" And I tell them, "Good, you do not have to, in your direct purchase agreement." Um, how does this work? A lot of misconceptions about tips not being a public entity. It absolutely is. It's an in-house department of a state entity in Texas. And then also the specific requirements. I think people trip up on that in frequently. They say, "I've read your
Yes.
contract. How does this get playground equipment delivered to my public entity, or can we change the terms?" And I always point them to the TIPS contract, which recommends and contemplates and believes that the public entity member and the tips vendor are going to enter that direct agreement, that tips was the procurement process, it was the bidding process, and now that bidding process is over, and now you're entering that purchase order or that contract with the tips vendor, which states the specific compensation, delivery times, venue in the state of the public entity, or however you all agree to negotiate that. You
Mhm.
have completed the procurement process through TIPS, and now the way the TIPS contract is structured, you can directly contract and agree and add local legal requirements as you see fit to effectuate that purchase.
Absolutely. And a question I get all the time from my agencies and members is, so, hey, can I add to my terms and conditions? And my go-to answers is, we expect you to. That
Yes.
where you've only put in terms and conditions to protect your procurement, you need to protect the buying agency. You need to enter into another agreement that allows you to do business now that you have procured through tips. So
That's
yeah.
right.
And so oftentimes there's people who are skeptical. We kind of hit on that. What is the best steps, or what would you say to someone who is skeptical? Obviously, the first thing they got to do is review their law in their state, right? But from there, what is generally happening, and how can we help?
Yeah, so I guess to sort of explain the ideal tips purchase from my perspective is public entity has a need. They need a good, a service, they need to make a purchase. They turn to their laws and policies and say, okay, I'm allowed to make this purchase with this fund type in this amount through cooperative purchasing established. Who
Yeah.
are my preferred cooperatives? Tips is one that is compliant and reliable. So I select Tips. I know what good and service I need. So I might go to Tips website if I don't have Tips vendors that I'm already have established relationships. I might go to the Tips website and find the contract for um technology if I'm purchasing technology, or furniture if I'm making a furniture purchase. Find the contract that applies and has a scope that covers my specific purchase type. I'll click on that contract, and I'll find a list of all the awarded vendors. Maybe I want to specify exactly what I'm looking for, and I can use Tips request for quote function. So I go in my member portal, I say I need this many tablets, or I'm looking for this type of playground equipment.
Mhm.
I'll select the applicable contracts, and every vendor that's interested and can provide those goods or services to me responds with a competitive quote. We've already procured them. We don't need that competitive quote, but if it's helpful, we can seek it. So then I find a reputable vendor that's been procured by Tips and services provides those goods and services in my jurisdiction. And once you find that vendor, or you if you already have a Tips vendor in your locale, once you've selected your vendor, they've already been procured. You really just engage them. You say, hey, I need to make a Tips purchase. Make sure they know it is through the Tips cooperative from the outset. Vendor responds with a Tips quote, giving their contractual Tips pricing for items covered by the contract. The parties agree. And if the public entity wants to, they can send that quote to Tips for pricing verification. Am I getting my Tips pricing?
Mhm.
Um, or they can choose to proceed with the purchase freely. And either way, you must report that purchase to Tips so that you do have the recorded compliance, you do have the due diligence documentation in the event of audit or challenge, and you move on with your purchase as you would if you did your own bid. The difference is, instead of 2 months of bid development, closing, award, you have gone to the Tips website, decided on a reputable and available vendor for those goods and services. That might take a day. Maybe it takes a little longer, but it certainly doesn't take months of preparation.
Mhm.
And you proceed with that purchase. Download the due diligence to your procurement file. So if you're audited tomorrow or in 3 years, you have it. And
Mhm.
that's the efficiency that it provides.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And and that, like you said, it's efficient, and it's allowing agencies to streamline their procurement. And I always go back to, yes, the time, but for us, even me as private citizen in a municipality, right? Uh, it's saving the municipalities, the schools, whoever's going out to bid, not just hundreds, but quite literally, the data shows thousands of dollars in administrative cost
Mhm.
every time that they would go out to bid, right? So
Yes.
that's always what motivates me and Tips. But if that was a very great explanation to start to finish. But before we kind of wrap up here, is there anything else that you'd want someone to know from this conversation on what would you want that to be?
I think what I want vendors and members to know is, and I think I've made it clear, it's always the public entity's decision to proceed with a cooperative purchase and analyze whether that is an appropriate method. That's the most important part. And I know
Mhm.
vendors have a tendency to um, want that sale to go through, and they may be frustrated with the particular requirements for that public entity. But ultimately, that's something that I want to establish. It's always the public entity's choice whether to proceed with a cooperative purchase. And then the next thing I want people to understand as we close out today is that I think if you have questions or misunderstandings about the process, I think TIPS is amazing in its responsiveness and willingness to assist vendors and members understand and have access to this efficiency. So always TIPS to me is shockingly responsive and helpful. So always reach out to TIPS, to your program managers like Michael. Um, Also turn to the TIPS websites, the available resources that they have so that you can fully understand the cooperative efficiency that's being offered to public entities and vendors throughout the nation.
Absolutely. Well, Sarah, I want to thank you again for joining us today. I can tell you already you're going to be back. So brace yourself for that. No, every time we talk, even on, off air, whatever, every time we talk, I learn at least 3 new things. So,
Oh, thank you,
but
Michael. Thank you for having me.
yes. Absolutely. We love it. Well, again, thank you, Sarah. And for any of those agencies out there who were listening in, if you want to join the nearly 15,000 agencies who are using our cooperative today, that's very simple. It's free and always free to use our contracts as well. You can do that very simply at the TIPS website. And don't forget to change your choice of law and venue, like we talked about today. And then if you're a vendor who would like to then serve those public agencies, that involves a competitive bid process where you can go to our website, click become a vendor, and hopefully be able to respond to one of our contract categories. That's all we have for you today. We thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the Purchasing Made Personal podcast.